skill. Through Elaine's fury, a quiet, simmering fury that clenched her jaw, she got lost on the way to the apartments. Those rooms had been hers since she left the nursery, yet twice she took a turn only to find that it did not lead where she expected, and a sweeping flight of marble-railed stairs took her in entirely the wrong direction. Burn her! Now being with child was fuzzing her wits completely. She could feel puzzlement and increasing concern through the bond as she retraced her way, climbed a different set of stairs. Some of the guardswomen murmured uneasily, not quite loudly enough for her to make out the words, until the banner woman in charge, a slim, cool-eyed Saldaean named Devora Zarbayan, silenced them with a sharp word. Even Avienda began looking at her doubtfully. Well, she was not about to have getting lost in the palace flung in her face. Not a word from anybody, she said grimly. Not one, she added when Birgitta opened her mouth anyway. The golden-haired woman snapped her jaws shut and gave a tug at her thick braid, almost the way Nynaeve did. She did not bother to keep disapproval from her face, and the bond still carried puzzlement and worry. Enough that Elaine began to feel worried herself. She struggled to fight that off before she found herself wringing her hands and apologizing. It was that strong. I think I'll try to find my rooms, if I can have just a few words, Birgitta said in a tight voice. I want to get dry before I wear out my boots. We need to talk of this later. I fear there's nothing to be done, but with a stiff nod, barely bending her neck, she stalked off, slashing her unstrung bow from side to side. Elaine almost called her back. She wanted to, but Birgitta had as much need of dry clothing as she. Besides, her mood had swung to grumpy and stubborn. She was not going to talk about losing her way in the very halls where she had grown up, not now or later. Nothing to be done? What did that mean? If Birgitta was suggesting that her wits were too befuddled to be set straight, her jaw tightened all over again. At last, after yet another unexpected turn, she found the tall, lion-carved doors of her apartments and heaved a small sigh of relief. She had begun to think her memories of the palace really were completely jumbled. A pair of guardswomen, resplendent in broad-brimmed hats with white plumes and lace-edged sashes embroidered with the white lions slanting across their burnished breastplates, and more pale lace at their cuffs and necks, stiffened on either side of the doors at her approach. She intended them to have red-lacquered breastplates to match their silk coats and breeches when she had time to spend on that sort of thing. If they were to be so pretty that any assailant would discount them until it was too late, she would make them positively gaudy. None of the guardswomen seemed to mind. In fact, they were eagerly looking forward to the lacquered breastplates. She had overheard some who were unaware she was near disparage the guardswomen, mostly women, but including Doylin Mellar, their own commander. Yet she had full confidence in their ability to protect her. They were brave and determined, or they would not have been there. Urith Azeri and others who had been merchants' guards, a rare trade for women, gave daily lessons in the sword, and one or another of the warders gave a second lesson every day, too. Saritha's Ned Yarman and Van Dien's Jane were quite laudatory about how quickly they learned. James said it was because they did not think they already knew something of how to use a blade, which seemed silly. How could you believe you already knew something if you needed lessons in it? Despite the guards already there, Devora told off two of those who accompanied her, and they drew their swords and went inside, while Elaine waited in the corridor with Avienda and the rest, tapping her foot impatiently. Everyone avoided looking at her. The search was not a slur on the women guarding the doors. She supposed it was possible for someone to scale the side of the palace. There certainly was carving enough to provide handholds, yet she felt irritation at being made to wait on it. Only when they came out and reported to Devora that there were no assassins waiting within, no Aes Sedai waiting to whisk Elaine back to Elida and the tower, were she and Avienda allowed to enter, with the guardswomen forming up on either side of the doors with the others. She was not sure they would have physically prevented her from entering sooner, but so far she had been unwilling to put it to the test. Being restrained by her own bodyguards would have been beyond insufferable, no matter that they were just doing their jobs. Better to avoid the possibility altogether. A small fire burned on the white marble hearth of the anteroom, but it seemed to give little warmth. The carpets had been taken up for spring, and the floor tiles felt cold beneath the soles of her shoes, stout as they were. Asanda, her maid, spread red-trimmed gray skirts with still surprising grace, though the slim, white-haired woman suffered from painful joints, which she denied and refused healing for. She would have refused any suggestion that she return to her retirement as vehemently. Elaine's golden lily was embroidered large on her breast and proudly worn. Two younger women flanked her a pace back in similar livery, but with smaller lilies, stocky, square-faced sisters named Sephany and Neris. Shy-eyed, yet quite well-trained by Asanda, they made deep curtsies, settling nearly to the floor. Slow-moving and frail Asanda might be, but she never wasted time in idle chit-chat or stating the obvious. There were no exclamations over how wet Elaine and Avienda were, though doubtless the guardswomen had alerted her. "We'll get you both warm and dry, my lady, and right into something suitable for meeting mercenaries. The red silk with fire drops on the neck should impress them suitably. It's past time you ate, too. Don't bother telling me you have, my lady. Neris, go fetch meals from the kitchens for the Lady Elaine and the Lady Avienda." Avienda gave a snort of laughter, yet she had long since ceased objecting to being called lady. And a good thing, since she would never stop Asanda. With servants, there were things you commanded and things you simply had to tolerate. Neris grimaced and took a deep breath for some reason, but dropped another deep curtsy, this to Asanda, and one only slightly deeper to Elaine. She and her sister were every bit as much in awe of the elderly woman as they were of the daughter heir of Andor, before gathering her skirts and darting into the corridor. Elaine grimaced too. The guardswomen had also told Asanda about the mercenaries, apparently, and that she had not eaten. She hated people talking about her behind her back, but how much of that was her shifting moods? She could not recall being upset before because a maid knew what dress to lay out in advance, or because someone knew she was hungry and sent for a meal without being asked. Servants talked among themselves, gossiped constantly, in truth, that was a given, and passed along anything that might help their mistress be served better if they were good at their jobs. Asanda was very good at hers. Still, it rankled, and it rankled the worse for her knowing that it was irrational. She let Asanda lead her and Avienda into the dressing room, with Sephany bringing up the rear. She was feeling very miserable by this time, damp and shivering, not to mention angry with Birgitta for stalking off, frightened by losing her way in the place she had grown up, and sullen over her bodyguards gossiping about her. In truth, she felt absolutely wretched. Soon enough, though, Asanda had her out of her wet things and wrapped in a large white towel that had been hanging on a warming rack in front of the wide marble fireplace at the end of the room. That had a soothing effect. This fire was not at all small, and the room seemed not far short of hot, a welcome heat that soaked into the flesh and banished shivers. Asanda toweled Elaine's hair dry while Sephany performed the same office for Avienda, which chagrined Avienda still, though this was hardly the first time. She and Elaine frequently brushed one another's hair at night, yet accepting this simple service from a lady's maid put spots of color in Avienda's sun-dark cheeks. When Sephany opened one of the wardrobes lining one wall, Avienda sighed deeply. She held one towel loosely draped around her. Another woman drying her hair might be embarrassing, but near nudity presented no difficulties, and a second, smaller, was wrapped around her hair. "Do you think I should wear wetlander clothes, Elaine, since we are going to meet these mercenaries?" she asked in tones of great reluctance. Asanda smiled. She enjoyed dressing Avienda in silks. Elaine hid a smile of her own, no easy task, since she wanted to laugh. Her sister pretended to disdain silks, but she seldom missed an opportunity to wear them. "If you can bear it, Avienda," she said gravely, adjusting her own robing towel carefully. Asanda saw her in her skin every day, and Sephany too, but it was nothing to let happen without reason. "For best effect, we should both overawe them. You won't mind too much, will you?" But Avienda was already at the wardrobe, her towel gaping carelessly as she fingered dresses. Several sets of Aiel garb hung in another of the wardrobes, but Tylen had given her chests of finely cut silks and woolens before they left Ebu Dar, enough to fill nearly a quarter of the carved cabinets. That brief burst of amusement left Elaine no longer feeling as if she had to argue over everything, so without demurral she let Asanda get her into the red silk, with fire drops the size of a finger joint sewn in a band around the high neck. The garment would impress, for sure, with no need for other jewels, though in truth the great serpent ring on her right hand was jewel enough for anyone. The white-haired woman had a delicate touch, but Elaine still winced as she began doing up the rows of tiny buttons down her back, tightening the bodice across her tender bosom. Opinions varied on how long that would last, yet all agreed that she could expect more swelling. Oh, how she wished Rand were near enough to share the full effect of her bond with him. That would teach him to get her with child so carelessly. Of course, she could have drunk the heart-leaf tea before lying with him. She pushed that thought away firmly. This was all Rand's fault, and that was that. Avienda chose blue, which she often did, with rows of tiny pearls edging the bodice. The silk was not so deeply cut as Ebu Dari fashions, yet still would display a little cleavage. Few dresses sewn in Ebu Dar failed to do that. As Stephanie began fastening her buttons, Avienda fondled something she had retrieved from her belt pouch, a small dagger with a rough hilt of deer horn wrapped in gold wire. It was also a Turangrial, though Elaine had not been able to puzzle out what it did before pregnancy forced a halt to such studies. She had not known her sister was carrying the thing. Avienda's eyes were almost dreamy as she stared at it. "Why does that fascinate you so?" Elaine asked. This was not the first time she had seen the other woman absorbed in that knife. Avienda gave a start and blinked at the dagger in her hands. The iron blade, it looked like iron at least, and felt almost like iron, had never been sharpened so far as Elaine could tell, and was little longer than her palm, though wide in proportion. Even the point was too blunt for stabbing. "I thought to give it to you, but you never said anything about it, so I thought I might be wrong, and then we would believe you were safe, from some dangers at least, when you were not. So I decided to keep it. That way, if I am right, at least I could protect you, and if I am wrong, it does no harm." Elaine shook her towel-wrapped head in confusion. "Right about what? What are you talking about?" "This," Avienda said, holding up the dagger. "I think that if you have this in your possession, the shadow cannot see you. Not the eyeless or the shadow-twisted, maybe not even Leaf Blighter. Except that I must be wrong if you did not see it." Stephanie gasped, her hands going still, until Asanda murmured a soft admonition. Asanda had lived too long to be shaken by mere mention of the shadow, or much else for that matter. Elaine stared. She had tried teaching Avienda to make Turangrial, but her sister possessed not a scrap of facility there. Yet perhaps she had a different skill, maybe even one that could be called a talent. "Come with me," she said, and taking Avienda's arm, she almost pulled her out of the dressing room. Asanda followed with a torrent of protest, and Stephanie attempting to continue buttoning up Avienda's dress on the fly. In the larger of the apartment's two sitting rooms, goodly fires blazed in both of the fireplaces, and if the air was not so warm as in the dressing room, it was still comfortable. The scroll-edged table bordered with low-backed chairs in the middle of the white-tiled floor was where she and Avienda took most of their meals. Several leather-bound books from the palace library sat in a stack on one end of the table, histories of Andor and books of tales. The mirrored stand lamps gave a good light, and they often read here of an evening. More importantly, a long side table against one dark-paneled wall was covered with Turangrial from the cache the kin had kept hidden in Ebu Dar. Cups and bowls, statuettes and figurines, jewelry, all manner of things. Most looked commonplace, aside from perhaps the strangeness of design, yet even the most fragile-seeming could not be broken, and some were much lighter or heavier than they appeared. She could no longer safely study them in any meaningful way. She had Min's assurance her babes could not be harmed, but with her control of the power so slippery, damaging herself was more a possibility than ever. Yet she changed what was on the table every day, picking out pieces at random from the panniers kept in the apartment's box room, just so she could look at them and speculate on what she had learned before getting with child. Not that she had learned very much, well, nothing really, but she could think on them. There was no worry of anything being stolen. Rena had rooted out most, if not all, of the dishonest among the servants, and the constant guard at the entrance saw to the rest. Mouth tight with disapproval, dressing was done in the dressing room, decently, not out where anyone at all might walk in. Asanda resumed her task with Elaine's buttons. Stephanie, likely as agitated by the older woman's displeasure as anything else, breathed hard as she worked on Avienda's. Pick out something and tell me what you think it does, Elaine said. Looking and speculating had done no good, as she had not expected it to. Yet if Avienda could somehow tell what a Terangrial did just by holding it. Jealousy surged up in her, hot and bitter, but she knocked it down, then for good measure jumped up and down on it until it vanished. She would not be jealous of Avienda. I'm not sure that I can, Elaine. I only think this knife makes a kind of warding, and I must be wrong or you would know it. You know more of these things than anyone. Elaine's cheeks heated with embarrassment. I don't know nearly as much as you seem to think. Try, Avienda. I've never heard of anyone being able to read Terangreal, but if you can, even a little, don't you see how wonderful that would be? Avienda nodded, but her face held doubt. Hesitantly, she touched a slim black rod, a pace long, and so flexible it could be bent into a circle and spring back, lying in the middle of the table. Touched it and jerked her hand back swiftly, wiping her fingers unconsciously on her skirt. This causes pain. Nynaeve told us that, Elaine said impatiently, and Avienda gave her a level look. Nynaeve Almira did not say you can change how much pain each blow gives. Uncertainty overcame her again at once, though, and her voice became tentative. At least I think that can be done. I think one blow can feel like 1 or 100. But I'm only guessing, Elaine. It is only what I think. Keep going, Elaine told her encouragingly. Maybe we'll find something that makes it certain. What about this? She picked up an oddly shaped metal cap, covered with strange angular patterns of what seemed to be the most minute engraving. It was much too thin to be of use as a helmet, though it was twice as heavy as it appeared. The metal felt slick, too, not simply smooth, as if it were oiled. Avienda put down the dagger reluctantly and turned the cap over once in her hands before setting it back on the table and taking up the dagger again. I think that allows you to direct a device of some sort, a machine. She shook her towel-wrapped head. But I do not know how or what kind of machine. You see, I'm only guessing again. Elaine would not let her stop, though. Terangreal after Terangreal Avienda touched or sometimes held for a moment, and every time she had an answer, delivered hesitantly and with cautions that it was only a surmise, but always an answer. She thought a small hinged box, apparently ivory and covered with rippling red and green stripes, held music, hundreds of tunes, perhaps thousands. With a Terangreal, that might be possible. After all, a fine music box might have cylinders for as many as 100 tunes, and some could play quite long pieces on one cylinder after another without changing them. A flattish white bowl, almost a pace across, was for looking at things that were far away, she thought, and a tall vase worked with vines in green and blue vines, would gather water out of the air. That sounded useless, but Avienda almost caressed it, and after consideration Elaine realized it would be very useful indeed in the waste, if it worked as Avienda believed, and someone figured out how to make it work. A black and white figurine of a bird with long wings spread in flight was for talking to people a long way off, she said. So was a blue figure of a woman, small enough to fit the palm of her hand, in an oddly cut skirt and coat. And 5 earrings, 6 finger rings, and 3 bracelets. Elaine began to think that Avienda was giving up, offering the same answer every time in hopes that she would stop asking. But then she realized that her sister's voice was becoming more confident rather than less, that the protests that she was only guessing had dwindled, and her guesses were growing in detail. A bent, featureless rod of dull black, as wide as her wrist. It seemed metal, yet one end accommodated itself to any hand that gripped it, made her think of cutting. either metal or stone if they were not too thick. Nothing that could catch fire, though. The apparently glass figure of a man, a foot tall, with his hand raised as if to signal stop, would chase away vermin, which would certainly have been useful, given Camelin's plague of rats and flies. A stone carving the size of her hand, all deep blue curves, it felt like stone at least, though somehow it did not really look carved, was for growing something, not plants. It made her think of holes, only they were not exactly holes, and she did not believe anyone had the channel to make it work. Only sing the right song. Some Terangrial did not require channeling, but really, singing? Done with Avienda's dress, Stephanie had grown enthralled with the recitation, her eyes getting wider and wider. Asanda listened with interest too, her head tilted to one side, murmuring small exclamations at each new revelation, but she was not bouncing on her toes the way Stephanie was. "What about that one, my lady?" the younger woman blurted when Avienda paused. She pointed to the statuette of a stout, bearded man with a merry smile, holding a book. 2 feet tall, it appeared to be age-darkened bronze, and was certainly heavy enough to be. "Looking at him always makes me want to smile too, my lady." "Me as well, Stephanie Peldon," Avienda said, stroking the bronze man's head. "He holds more than the book, you see. He holds thousands and thousands of books." Abruptly, the light of Sidar enveloped her, and she touched 2 thin flows of fire and earth to the bronze figure. Stephanie squeaked as 2 words in the old tongue appeared in the air above the statuette, as black as if printed with good ink. Some of the letters were shaped a little oddly, but the words were quite clear. Ansoan and Imsoan, floating on nothing. Avienda looked nearly as startled as the maid. "I think we have proof at last," Elaine said more calmly than she felt. Her heart was in her throat and pounding. Lies and truth, the 2 words might be translated. Or in context, perhaps fiction and not fiction would be better. It was proof enough for her. She marked where the flows touched the figure for when she could return to her studies. "But you shouldn't have done that. It isn't safe." The glow around Avienda vanished. "Oh, light!" she exclaimed, flinging her arms around Elaine. "I never thought. I have great toll to you. I never meant to endanger you or your babes. Never." "My babes and I are safe," Elaine laughed, hugging back. "Min's viewing?" Her babes were safe, at least, until they were born. So many babes died in their first year. Min had said nothing beyond them being born healthy. Min had said nothing about her not being burned out either, but she had no intention of bringing that up when already feeling guilty. "You have no toe to me. It was you I was thinking of. You could have died or burned yourself out." Avienda pulled back enough to look into Elaine's eyes. What she saw there reassured her, for a small smile curved her lips. "I did make it work, though. Perhaps I can take over the study of them. With you to guide me, it should be perfectly safe. We have months before you can do it yourself." "You have no time at all, Avienda," a woman's voice said from the doorway. "We are leaving. I hope you have not grown too used to wearing silk. I see you, Elaine." Avienda leaped away from the embrace, flushing furiously, as 2 Aiel women entered the room, and not just any 2 Aiel. Pale-haired Nadir, as tall as most men and wide with it, was a wise one of considerable authority among the Goshin. And Dorinda, her long red hair touched with white, was the wife of Baal, clan chief of the Goshin, though her true prominence came from being roof mistress of Smoke Springs Hold, the clan's largest hold. It was she who had spoken. "I see you, Dorinda," Elaine said. "I see you, Nadir. Why are you taking Avienda away?" "You said I could stay with Elaine to help guard her back," Avienda protested. "You did, Dorinda." Elaine took her sister's hand in a firm grip, and Avienda squeezed back. "You and the wise ones, too." Gold and ivory bracelets clattered as Dorinda shifted her dark shawl. "How many do you need to guard your back, Elaine?" she asked dryly. "You have perhaps 100 or more dedicated to nothing else, and as hard as Fardar Ismai." A smile deepened the creases at the corners of her eyes. I think those women outside wanted us to give up our belt knives before letting us in. Nadir touched the horn hilt of her knife, her green eyes holding a fierce light, though it was unlikely the guards had shown any such desire. Even Birgitta, suspicious of everyone when it came to Elaine's safety, could see no danger from the Aiel, and Elaine had accepted certain obligations when she and
Hey,
adopted one
D-Man, how
another.
you doing?
Wise ones who had taken
Oh,
part
it's
in
all
that
good,
ceremony,
bro.
as Nadir had, could go wherever they wished in the palace,
Sorry, I
whenever they
haven't been
wished.
around either.
That was one of the
Eh,
obligations.
what can I
As for
say?
Dorinda, her presence was so
it's
commanding, if in a
been
quiet way,
a
that
rough
it
one
seemed
lately.
inconceivable anyone would attempt to bar her way.
Hope you've
Your
been doing
training
good,
has
though,
been in
D-Man.
abeyance too long, Avienda, Nadir said firmly. Go and change into proper clothing. But I am learning so much from Elaine, Nadir. Weaves even you do not know. I think I can make it rain in the threefold land. And just now we learned that I can... Whatever you may have learned, Nadir cut in sharply, it seems you have forgotten as much, such as the fact that you are an apprentice of the will. Power is the least of what a wise one must know, else only those can channel would be wise ones. Now go and change and count your luck that I do not make you return in your skin to face a strapping. The tents are being struck as we speak, and if the clan's departure is delayed, you will face the strap. Without another word, Avienda dropped Elaine's hand and ran from the room, bumping into Neris, who staggered and almost dropped the large cloth-covered tray she was carrying. At a quick gesture from Asanda, Stephanie hurried after Avienda. Neris's eyes went wide at the sight of the Aiel women, but Asanda admonished her for taking so long, and directed her to lay out the meal on the table, setting the young maid into hurried motion while muttering apologies.
At least that's good that you're focusing on
Elaine
that.
wanted to run after Avienda too, to grasp
That
every
sucks that
moment
people
with her,
complain about the
but
price,
Nadir's
though.
words held her. You're leaving Camelin, Dorinda? Where are you going? As much as Elaine liked the Aiel, she did not want them wandering about the countryside.
I don't think
With the
people
situation
take
as
into
unstable as it was,
consideration
they were problem enough
not
simply
only the
venturing out of
cost
their
of what
camp
it
to hunt
costs
or
to
trade.
get it,
We
but
are
the
leaving
time it
Candor,
takes
Elaine.
to
In a few
sit
hours we
down
will
and
be
do
far
them.
beyond your borders. As to where, you must ask the
At least for me,
Kara
because I know for me, I'm still working on that
Nadir had walked over to study
110
what Neris
centimeter
was
one.
laying out, and Neris
I've
began
been
to
slacking
tremble
on
so
it,
that
but
she nearly dropped more than
in
one
my case,
dish.
it's
This
rough on
looks
my back.
good, but I do not recognize some of these herbs, the wise
So I
one
can only
said.
do so much
Your
for so
midwife
long a
has
time.
approved all of this, Elaine? I'll summon a midwife when my time is near, Nadir. Dorinda, you can't think Rand would want your destination kept from me. What did he say? Dorinda gave a small shrug. He sent a messenger, one of the black coats, with a letter for Bale. Bale let me read it, of course. Her tone said there had never been any question of her not reading it. But the Karakarn asked Bale not to tell anyone, so I cannot tell you. No midwife? Nadir said incredulously. Who tells you what to eat and drink? Who gives you the proper herbs? Stop looking daggers at me, woman. Melane's temper is worse than yours could ever be, but she has sense enough to let Monaella govern her in these things. Every woman in the palace governs what I eat, Elaine replied bitterly. Sometimes I think every woman in Camelin does. Dorinda, can't you at least... My lady, your food is getting cold, Asanda said mildly, but with just the touch of firmness that an elderly retainer would allow.
Nice. That's usually what I do.
Her
I'll
teeth, Elaine
have something
glided to
playing
the
in the
chair Asanda stood
background or
behind. She did not flounce,
whatnot,
much
just
she
so I
wanted
could
to. She
do
glided.
that and
Asanda produced
somewhat
an ivory
concentrate.
black hairbrush, and removing the towel from Elaine's head, began brushing her hair while she ate. She ate largely because not eating only meant someone would be told to fetch more hot food, because Asanda and her own bodyguards between them might well keep her there until she did. But except for some dried apple that had not gone bad, the meal was decidedly unappetizing. The bread was crusty but flecked with weevils, and the soaked dried beans, since all of the preserved beans had spoiled, were tough and tasteless. The apple was mixed in a bowl of herbs, sliced burdock root, black haw, cramp bark, dandelion, nettle leaf, with a touch of oil, and for meat she had a piece of kid simmered in bland broth, with next to no salt, as far as she could tell. She would have killed for salty beef dripping with fat. Avienda's plate had sliced beef. though it looked tough. She could as well ask for wine. To drink, she had her choice of water or goat's milk. She wanted tea almost as much as she did fatty meat, but even the weakest tea sent her running to make water, and she had quite enough difficulties with that as it was. So she ate methodically, mechanically, trying to think of anything but the tastes in her mouth, except for the apple at least. She tried to pry some news of Rand out of the two Aiel women, but it seemed they knew less than she, as far as they would admit, anyway. They could be close-mouthed when they wanted to be. She at least knew that he was somewhere far to the southeast. Somewhere in Tyr, she suspected, though he could as easily have been on the plains of Merida or in the spine of the world. Beyond that, she knew he was alive, and not a whit more. She tried keeping the conversation on Rand in the hope they might let something slip, yet she might as well have tried dressing bricks with her fingers. Dorinda and Nadir had their own goal, convincing her to acquire a midwife right away. They went on and on about how she might be endangering herself and her babes, and not even Min's viewing would dissuade them. Very well, she said at last, slapping down her knife and fork. I will start looking for one today. And if she failed to find one, well, they would never know. I have a niece who's a midwife, my lady, Asanda said. Malphane dispenses herbs and ointments from a shop on Candle Street in the New City, and I believe she is quite knowledgeable. She patted a few last curls into place and stepped back with a pleased smile. You do so remind me of your mother, my lady. Elaine sighed. It seemed she was to have a midwife whether she wanted one or not. Someone else to see that her meals were wretched. Well, perhaps the midwife could suggest a remedy for those backaches at night, and the tender bosom. Thank the light she had been spared the desire to sick up. Women who could channel never suffered that part of pregnancy. When Avienda returned, she was in Aiel garb again, with her still damp shawl draped over her arms, a dark scarf tied around her temples to hold back her hair, and a bundle on her back. Unlike the multitudes of bracelets and necklaces Dorinda and Nadir wore, she had a single silver necklace, intricately worked discs in a complex pattern, and one ivory bracelet densely carved with roses and thorns. She handed Elaine the blunt dagger. You must keep this so you will be safe. I will try to visit you as often as I can. There may be time for an occasional visit, Nadir said severely. But you have fallen behind and must work hard to catch up. Strange, she mused, shaking her head. To speak casually from so far. To cover leagues, hundreds of leagues in a step. Strange things we have learned in the wetlands. We must go. Wait, Elaine told them. Wait, just a moment. Clutching the dagger, she raced to her dressing room. Stephanie paused in hanging up Avienda's blue dress to curtsy, but Elaine ignored her and opened the carved lid of her ivory jewelry chest. Sitting atop the necklaces and bracelets and pins in their compartments were a brooch in the shape of a turtle that appeared to be amber, and a seated woman, wrapped in her own hair, apparently carved from age-darkened ivory. Both were Angreal. Placing the antler-hilted dagger in the chest, she picked up the turtle and then impulsively snatched up the twisted stone dream ring, all red and blue and brown. It seemed to be useless to her since she became pregnant, and if she could manage to weave spirit, she still had the silver ring worked in braided spirals that had been recovered from Ispan. Hurrying back to the sitting room, she found Dorinda and Nadir arguing, or at least having an animated discussion, while Asanda pretended to be checking for dust, running her fingers under the edge of the table. From the angle of her head, she was listening avidly, though. Neris, putting Elaine's dishes back on the tray, was gaping at the Aiel women openly. I told her she would feel the strap if we delayed the departure, Nadir was saying with some heat as Elaine entered the room. It is hardly fair if she is not the cause, but I said what I said. You will do as you must, Dorinda replied calmly, but with a tightness to her eyes that suggested these were
Oh
not the
shit.
first
Hell
words they
yeah,
had
D man.
exchanged. Perhaps we will not delay anything, and perhaps Avienda will pay the price gladly to say farewell to her sister.
That's badass.
Elaine did not bother with trying to argue for Avienda. It would have done no good. Avienda herself displayed an equanimity that would have credited an Aes Sedai, as if whether she was to be beaten for another's fault were of no matter at all. These are for you, Elaine said, pressing the ring and the brooch
Comes
into
out
her
about
sister's
that
hand.
big when I use
Not
my
as gifts, I'm afraid.
toke
The
stone.
White Tower will want them back, but to use as you need. Avienda looked at the things and gasped. Even the loan of these is a great gift. You shame me, sister. I have no farewell gift to give in return. You give me your friendship. You gave me a sister. Elaine felt a tear slide down her cheek. She essayed a laugh, but it was a weak, tremulous thing. How can you say you have nothing to give? You've given me everything. Tears glistened in Avienda's eyes, too. Despite the others watching, she put her arms around Elaine and hugged her hard. I will miss you, sister, she whispered. My heart is as cold as night. And mine, sister, Elaine whispered, hugging back equally hard. I will miss you, too, but you will be allowed to visit me sometimes. This isn't forever. No, not forever. But I will still miss you. They might have begun weeping next, only Dorinda laid her hands on their shoulders. It is time, Avienda. We must go if you are to have any hope of avoiding the strap. Avienda straightened with a sigh, scrubbing at her eyes. May you always find water and shade, sister. May you always find water and shade, sister, Elaine replied. The Aiel way had a finality about it, so she added, until I see your face again. And as quickly as that, they were gone. As quickly as that, she felt very alone. Avienda's presence had become a certainty, a sister to talk to, laugh with, share her hopes and fears with. But that comfort was gone. Asunda had slipped from the room while she and Avienda were hugging, and now she returned to set the coronet of the daughter heir on Elaine's head, a simple circlet of gold supporting a single golden rose on her forehead. So these mercenaries won't forget who they're talking to, my lady. Elaine did not realize her shoulders had slumped until she straightened them. Her sister was gone, yet she had a city to defend and a throne to gain. Duty would have to sustain her now. Chapter 16. The New Follower. The blue reception room, named for its arched ceiling, painted to display the sky and white clouds, and its blue floor tiles, was the smallest reception room in the palace, less than 10 paces square. The arched windows that made up the far wall, overlooking a courtyard, and still filled with glassed casements against the spring weather, gave a fair light, even with the rain falling outside. But despite 2 large fireplaces with carved marble mantels, a cornice of plaster lions, and a pair of tapestries bearing the white lion that flanked the doors, a delegation of Camelon's merchants would have been insulted to be received in the blue room, a delegation of bankers livid. Likely that was why Mistress Harford had put the mercenaries there, although they would not know they were being insulted. She herself was present, overseeing the pair of liveried young maids who were keeping the wine cups full from tall silver pitchers standing on a tray atop a plainly carved sideboard. But she had the embossed leather folder used to carry her reports pressed to her bosom, as if in anticipation of the mercenaries being dealt with quickly. Halwyn Nori, the wisps of white hair behind his ears as always looking like feathers, was standing in a corner, also with his leather folder clutched to his narrow chest. Their reports were a daily fixture, and seldom much in them to cheer the heart of late. Quite the opposite. Warned by the pair of guardswomen who had checked the room ahead of her, everyone was on their feet when Elaine entered with another pair at her back. Denny Colford, in charge of the guardswomen who had replaced Devora and the others, had simply ignored her order for them all to remain outside. Ignored her! She supposed they made a good show, swaggering proudly as they did, yet she could not stop grinding her teeth. Ariana and Saritha, formal in their fringed shawls, bowed their heads slightly in respect, but Mellar swept off his plumed hat in a flourishing bow, one hand laid over the lace-edged sash slanting across his burnished breastplate. The 6 golden knots brazed to that breastplate, 3 on each shoulder, rankled her, yet she had let them pass so far. His hatchet face offered her a smile that was much too warm, too, but then, however cold she was to him, He thought he had some chance with her because she had not denied the rumor her babes were his. Her reasons for not countering that filthy tale had changed. She no longer had need to protect her babes, Rand's babes, yet she let it stand. Give the man time and he would braid a rope for his own neck. And if he failed to, she would braid one for him. The mercenaries, all well into their middle years, were only a heartbeat behind Mellar, though not so elaborate in their courtesies. Evard Cordwin, a tall, square-jawed Andorran, wore a large ruby in his left ear, and Aldred Gomyson, short and slender, the front of his head shaved, had horizontal stripes of red and green and blue covering half his chest, far more than it seemed at all likely he was entitled to in his native Cairn. Hafin Bakavan, graying, was ornamented with a thick gold hoop in his left ear and a jeweled ring on every finger. The Damani was very stout, but the way he moved spoke of solid muscle beneath the fat. "Don't you have duties, Captain Mellor?" Elaine said coolly, taking one of the room's few chairs. There were only 5, arms and high backs, simply carved with vines and leaves, and lacking even a hint of gilt. Standing in a widely spaced row in front of the windows, the chairs put the light behind whoever sat in them. On a bright day, those given audience here squinted in the glare. Unfortunately, that advantage was lost today. The 2 guardswomen took up positions behind her and to either side, each with a hand resting on her sword hilt, watching the mercenaries with fierce expressions that made Bakavan smile and Gomyson rub his chin to half hide a sly grin. The women gave no sign of being offended. They knew the point of their uniforms. Elaine knew they would wipe away any smiles very quickly if they needed to draw their blades. "My first duty above all is to protect you, my lady." Easing his sword, Mellar eyed the mercenaries as though he expected them to attack her, or perhaps him. Gomyson looked bitterly amused, and Bakavan laughed aloud. All 3 men had empty scabbards, Cordwin a pair on his back. No mercenary was allowed to enter the palace carrying so much as a dagger. "I know you have other duties," she said levelly, "because I assigned them to you, Captain. Training the men I brought in from the countryside. You're not spending as much time with them as I expect. You have a company of men to train, Captain. A company of old men and boys, and surely enough to occupy his hours. He spent few enough with her bodyguards in spite of commanding them. That was just as well, really. He liked to pinch bottoms. I suggest you see to them. Now." Rage flashed across Millar's narrow face. He actually quivered, but he mastered himself instantly. It was all gone so fast that she might have imagined it, but she knew she had not. "As you command, my lady," he said smoothly. His smile had an oily smoothness, too. "My honor is to serve you well." With another flamboyant bow, he started for the door, as near to strutting as made no difference. Little could dent Doylin Millar's demeanor for long. Bhagavan laughed again, throwing his head back. "Man wears so much lace now, I vow I keep expecting him to offer to teach us to dance, and now he does dance." The Cairn laughed, too, a nasty, guttural sound. Mellar's back stiffened and his step hesitated, then quickened, so much so that he bumped into Birgitta at the doorway. He hurried on without stopping to ask pardon, and she frowned after him. The bond carried anger, quickly suppressed, and impatience, which was not, before shutting the door behind her and moving to stand beside Elaine's chair with one hand resting on the chair back. Her thick braid was not so neatly done as usual after having been undone for drying, but the uniform of the Captain General suited her. Taller than Gomyson in her heeled boots, Birgitta had a commanding presence when she wanted to. The mercenaries offered her small bows, respectful, though not deferential. Whatever misgivings of her they might have entertained in the beginning, few who had seen her use her bow or expose herself to the enemy had any remaining. "You speak as if you know, Captain Mellor, Captain Bakavan." Elaine put just a hint of question in that, but kept her tone casual. Birgitta was attempting to project confidence along the bond to equal her expression, yet wariness and worry kept intruding, and the ever-present weariness. Elaine tightened her jaw to fight a yawn. had to get some rest.
I've seen him once or twice before, my lady, the Damani replied cautiously. Not above thrice at most, I'd say. Yes, no more than that.
He tilted his head, eyeing her almost sideways.
You know he's followed my trade in the past.
He did not try to hide the fact, Captain, she said, as if tired of the subject. Had he let anything interesting slip, she might have arranged to question him alone, but pressing was not worth the risk of Mellar discovering that questions were being asked. He might run, then, before she could learn what she wanted to know.
Do we really have need of the Aes Sedai, my lady? Buckingham asked. The other Aes Sedai, he added, glancing at her great serpent ring.
He held out his silver cup, and one of the maids darted to fill it. They were both pretty women, perhaps not the best choices, but Rena had not much to choose from. Most of the maids were either young or else aged, and not so spry as they once had been.
All they've done the whole time we've been here is try to put us in awe of the White Tower's might and reach. I respect Aes Sedai as much as any man. Yes, do indeed. But if you'll forgive me, it gets tiresome when they turn to trying to browbeat a man. I vow it does, my lady.
A wise man always stands in awe of the tower, Saritha said calmly, shifting her brown-fringed shawl, perhaps to draw attention to it. Her dark, square face lacked the ageless look as yet, and she admitted yearning for it. Only fools fail to stand in awe of the tower, Cariana said on Saritha's heels. A bulky woman, as wide in the shoulders as most men, the green had no need for gestures. Her coppery face proclaimed what she was to anyone who knew what to look for, as loudly as did the ring on her right forefinger.
The word I hear, Gomyson said darkly, is that Tarvalon is besieged. I hear the White Tower is split, with two armorlands. I even hear the tower itself is held by the Black Aja.
A brave man to mention that rumor to Aes Sedai, but he still flinched saying it. Flinched and went right on.
Who is it you want us to be in awe of?
Do not believe everything you hear, Captain Gomyson. Saritha's voice was serene, a woman stating indisputable fact. Truth has more shadings than you might think, and distance often distorts truth into something very different from the facts. Lies about dark friend sisters are dangerous to repeat, however. What you had best believe, Cariana added just as calmly, is that the White Tower is the White Tower now and always, and you stand before three Aes Sedai. You should have a care with your words, Captain. Gomyson scrubbed the back of a hand across his mouth, but his dark eyes held defiance. Hunted defiance.
I'm just saying what can be heard on any street, he muttered. Are we here to talk about the White Tower? Cordwin said, scowling.
He emptied his wine cup before going on, as if this talk made him uneasy. How much had he already consumed? He seemed a trifle unsteady on his feet, and there was a touch of slur in his words.
The tower is hundreds of leagues from here, and what happens there is no business of ours. True, friend, Buckingham said, true. Our business is swords, swords and blood, which, my lady, brings us to the sordid matter of,
he waggled thick, begemmed fingers,
gold. Every day we lose men, day after day with no end in sight, and there are very few suitable replacements to be found in the city. Not at all that I've found.
I'll be right back,
eyeing
everyone.
the young maid filling his cup. She welcomed his scrutiny and finished her task quickly, spilling wine on the floor tiles and making Mistress Harford frown.
Those that might have been are all signing up for the Queen's Guards.
That was true enough. Enlistments seemed to increase by the day. The Queen's Guards would be a formidable force, eventually. Unfortunately, the vast majority of those men were months from being able to handle a sword without stabbing themselves in the foot, and further from being of any use in battle.
As you say, friend, Buckingham murmured. As you say.
He directed a wide smile at Elaine. Perhaps he meant to seem friendly, or maybe reasonable, but it minded her of a man trying to sell her a pig in a sack.
Even after we're done here, finding new men won't be easy, my lady. Suitable men aren't found under cabbage leaves. No, they're not. Fewer men means fewer coins for our next hires, an inescapable fact of the world. We think it's only just that we receive compensation. Anger surged in Elaine. They thought she was desperate to hold on to them, was what they thought. Worse, they were. These three men represented better than 1,000 more between them. Even with what Gaibon had brought her, that would be a grievous loss, especially if it started other mercenaries thinking her cause was lost. Mercenaries disliked being on the losing side. They would run like rats fleeing fire to avoid that. Her anger surged, but she held it in rein, by a hair's breadth. She could not keep the scorn from her voice, though. Did you think you would take no casualties? Did you expect to mount guard and take gold for it without bearing your swords? You signed for so much gold each day, Birgitta put in. She did not say how much, because every company had bargained for its own agreement. The last thing they needed was for the mercenary companies to grow jealous of each other. As it was, it seemed that half the common room fights the guards broke up were between men of different companies. A fixed amount. To put it cruelly, the more men you lose, the greater your profit. Ah, Captain General, the stout man said blandly, but you forget the death money that has to be paid to the widows and orphans. Thomason made a choking noise, and Cordwin stared at Bhagavan incredulously, then tried to cover it by draining his wine cup again. Elaine trembled, her hands tightening to fists on the arms of her chair. She would not give way to anger. She would not. I intend to hold you to your agreements, she said coldly. Well, at least she was not raging. You'll be paid what you signed for, including the usual victory after I gain the throne, not a penny more. If you try to back out, I'll assume you are turning coat and going over to Aramilla, in which case I'll have you and your companies arrested and put outside the gates without swords or horses. The maid, refilling Cordwin's wine cup yet again, suddenly squealed and danced away from him, rubbing her hip. The anger Elaine had been holding down fountained white hot. And if one of you ever dares fondle one of my women, he and his company will be put out without swords, horses, or boots. Do I make myself clear? Very clear, my lady. Bhagavan's voice held a distinct chill, and his wide mouth was tight. Very clear indeed. And now, since our discussion seems concluded, may we withdraw? Think carefully, Saritha said suddenly. Will the White Tower choose to see an Aes Sedai on the Lion Throne, or a fool like Aramilla Marn? Count the Aes Sedai in this palace, Cariana added. Count the Aes Sedai inside. There are none in Aramilla's camps. Count and decide where the White Tower's favor lies. Count, Saritha said, and remember that the White Tower's displeasure can be fatal. It was very hard to believe that one of them must be Black Alja, yet it must be so. Unless it was Marililla, of course. Elaine hoped that was not so. She liked Marililla. But then she liked Cariana and Saritha, too. Not as much as she did Marililla, yet still a liking. Anyway she looked at it, a woman she liked was a dark friend, and already under penalty of death. When the mercenaries had departed, making their courtesies hurriedly, and Mistress Harfor had sent the maids away with the remnants of the wine, Elaine leaned back in her chair and sighed. I handled that very badly, didn't I? Mercenaries require a strong hand on the reins, Birgitta replied, but there was doubt in the bond, doubt and worry. If I may say, my lady, Norrie said in his dry voice, I cannot see anything else you could have done. Mildness would only have emboldened them to make further demands. He had been so still that Elaine had almost forgotten he was there. Blinking at the world, he seemed a wading bird, wondering where the water had gone. In contrast to Mistress Harfor's neatness, ink stains marked his tabard and his fingers.
She eyed the leather folder in his hands with distinct distaste. "Will you leave us, please, Saritha, Cariana?" she said. They hesitated slightly, but there was nothing they could do save bow their heads and glide from the room like swans. "And you too as well," she added over her shoulder to the guardswomen. They did not so much as twitch. "Outside," she snapped, with a jerk of her head that set her braids swaying. "Now." Oh, the pair jumped for her, they did. They headed for the door so fast they might as well have trotted. Elaine scowled as the door closed behind them. "Burn me, I don't want to hear any bloody bad news. Not today. I don't want to hear how much of the food brought in from Ilion and Tyr is already spoiled when it arrives. I don't want to hear about arson, or flour black with weevils, or sewers breeding rats faster than they can be killed, or flies so thick you'd think Camelin was a filthy stable. I want to hear some bloody good news for a change." Burn her? She sounded petulant. Truth be told, she felt petulant. Oh, how that grated! She was trying to gain a throne and behaving like a child in the nurseries. Master Nori and Mistress Harfor exchanged glances, which only made matters worse. He fondled his folder with a sigh of regret. The man enjoyed droning his numbers, even when they were dire. At least they no longer balked at giving their reports in company. Well, not very far. Jealous of their own responsibilities, each was wary of the other straying, and quick to point out where some imagined boundary had been crossed. Still, they managed to run the palace and the city efficiently, with few barked knuckles. "Are we private, my lady?" Rena asked. Elaine drew a deep breath and performed novice exercises that seemed to have no calming effect whatsoever, then attempted to embrace the source. To her surprise, Saidar came to her easily, filling her with the sweetness of life and joy, and soothing her moods, too. It was always that way. Anger or sorrow or just being with child might interfere with embracing the power in the first place, yet once it filled her, her emotions stopped jumping about. Deftly she wove fire and air, just so, with traces of water. But when she was done, she did not release the source. The feel of being filled with the power was wondrous, yet not that much more so than knowing she would not be wanting to weep for no reason, or shout for as little in the next moment. After all, she was not foolish enough to draw too deeply. "We are private," she said. Saidar touched her ward and was gone. Someone had tried to listen in. Not the first time that had happened. With so many women who could channel gathered in the palace, it would have been surprising if no one attempted to snoop, but she wished she knew how to trace whoever was making those attempts. As it was, she hardly dared say anything of substance without a ward in place. "Then I have a little good news," Mistress Harfor said, shifting her folder but not opening it. "From John Skellet." The barber had been most assiduous about carrying his reports, approved beforehand by Rena, out to Aramilla and bringing back what he could learn in the camps outside the city. He was in the employ of Nayan Roan, but Nayan supporting Aramilla's claim would surely share Skellet's reports with Aramilla. Unfortunately, what he had been able to learn so far had not been of much use. He says that Aramilla and the high seats supporting her intend to be in the first party to ride into Camelin. She boasts of it constantly, it seems. Elaine sighed. Aramilla and the others stayed together, moving from camp to camp according to no pattern she could see, and for some time great effort had gone into trying to learn where they would be ahead of time. A simple matter, then, to send soldiers through a gateway to seize all of them at once and decapitate her opposition. As simple as such things could be, anyway. Men would die under the best of circumstances. Some of the high seats might well escape. Yet if only Aramilla herself could be taken, there would be an end to it. Elenia and Naon had made public renunciation of their own claims, which was irreversible. That pair might go on supporting Aramilla if they remained free. They had tied themselves to her tightly. But with Aramilla in hand, all Elaine really would have to contend with was gaining the support of at least 4 more of the great houses. As if it were easy. So far, efforts in that direction had proved futile. Perhaps today would bring good news on that front, though. But this news was useless.
If Aramilla and the others were riding into Camelin, it would mean the city was beyond the brink of falling. Worse, if Aramilla was boasting, she must believe it would happen soon. The woman was a fool in many ways, but it would be a mistake to underestimate her completely. She had not carried her claim this far by being an absolute fool. "This is your good news?" Birgitta said. She saw the implications, too. A hint of when might help. Rena spread her hands. "Aramilla gave Skelet a gold crown with her own hands once, my lady. He turned it over to me as proof that he's reformed." Her lips compressed for a moment. Skelet had saved himself from hanging, yet he would never regain trust. "That's the only time the man's been within 10 paces of her. He has to go by what he can pick up gossiping with the other men." She hesitated. "He's very afraid, my lady. The men in those camps are certain they'll take the city in a matter of days." "Afraid enough to turn his coat a third time?" Elaine asked quietly. There was nothing to say to the other matter. "No, my lady. If Nayan or Amarilla learns what he's done, he's a dead man, and he knows it. But he's afraid if the city falls, they will learn. I think he may bolt soon." Elaine nodded grimly. Mercenaries were not the only rats to flee fire. "Do you have any good news, Master Nori?" The first clerk had been standing quietly, fingering his embossed leather folder and trying to appear as if he were not listening to Rena. "I think I can better Mistress Harfor, my lady." There might have been a touch of triumph in his smile. Of late, it was rare for him to have better news than she. "I have a man I believe can follow Melar successfully. May I have him brought in?" Now that was excellent news. 5 men had died trying to follow Doylan Melar when he went out into the city at night, and the coincidence seemed strained. The first time it had appeared the fellow fell afoul of a footpad, and she thought nothing of it beyond settling a pension on the man's widow. The guards managed to keep crime under some control, except for arson at least, yet robbers used darkness as a cloak to hide in. The other 4 had seemed the same, killed with a single knife thrust, their purses emptied. But however dangerous the streets at night, coincidence hardly seemed credible. When she nodded, the spindly old man hurried to the door and opened one to put his head out. She could not hear what he said. The ward worked both ways, but in a few minutes a burly guardsman entered, pushing ahead of him a shuffling man with fetters on his wrists and ankles. Everything about the prisoner seemed average. He was neither fat nor thin, tall nor short. His hair was brown, of no particular shade she could name, and his eyes as well. His face was so ordinary she doubted she could describe him. No features stood out at all. His clothing was just as unremarkable. A plain brown coat and breeches of neither the best wool nor the worst, somewhat rumpled and beginning to show dirt. A lightly embossed belt with a simple metal buckle that might have 10,000 twins in Camelin. In short, he was eminently forgettable. Birgitta motioned the guardsman to stop the fellow well short of the chairs, and told him to wait outside. "Remarkable fellow," Nori said, watching the guardsman leave. "Afrin Hansard. He served your mother faithfully, and knows how to keep his mouth shut." "Chains?" Elaine said. "This is Samuel Hark, my lady," Nori said, eyeing the man with the sort of curiosity he might have shown toward an unfamiliar and oddly shaped animal. "A remarkably successful cut-purse. The guards only caught him because another ruffian, turned the cat on him, as they say in the streets, hoping to lessen his own sentence for a third offense of strong-arm robbery. A thief would be eager for that. Not only was the flogging longer, the thief mark branded on his forehead would be much mark branded on his forehead would be much harder to disguise or hide than the mark on his thumb for his second offense. Anyone who has managed to keep from being caught for as long as Master Hark should be able to carry out the task I have in mind for him." "I'm innocent, I am, my lady." Hark knuckled his forehead, the iron chains of his fetters clinking, and put on an ingratiating smile. He talked very quickly. It's all lies and happenstances. It is. I'm a good Queen's man, I am. I wore your mother's colours in the riots, my lady. And not that I took part in rioting, you understand. I'm a clerk when I have work, which I'm out of at the moment. But I wore her colours on my cap for all to see, I did. The bond was full of Birgitta's skepticism. Master Hark's rooms contained chests full of neatly cut purses, the first clerk went on. There are thousands of them, my lady. Quite literally thousands. I suppose you may regret keeping trophies. Most cut purses have sends it to get rid of the purse as soon as possible. I picks them up when I sees one, I does, my lady. Hark spread his hands as far as his chains allowed and shrugged, the very image of injured innocence. Maybe it were foolish, but I never saw no harm. Just a harmless sort of amusement, my lady. Mistress Harford sniffed loudly, disapproval clear on her face. Hark managed to look even more hurt. His rooms also contained coins to the value of over 120 gold crowns, secreted under the floorboards, in cubbyholes in the walls, in the rafters, everywhere. His excuse for that, Norrie raised his voice as Hark opened his mouth again, is that he distrusts bankers. He claims the money is an inheritance from an aged aunt in Four Kings. I myself very much doubt the magistrates in Four Kings will have registered such an inheritance, though. The magistrate judging his case says he seemed surprised to learn that inheritance are registered. Indeed, Hark's smile faded somewhat at being reminded. He says that he worked for Wilbin Sames, a merchant, until Sames's death 4 months ago. But Master Sames' daughter maintains the business, and neither she nor any of the other clerks recall any Samuel Hark. They hates me, they does, my lady, Hark said in a sullen voice. His hands gripped the chain between them in fists. I was gathering evidence of how they was stealing from the good master, his own daughter, mind. Only he died before I could give it to him, and I was turned out in the streets without a reference or a penny I was. They burned what I'd gathered, gave me a drubbing, and threw me out. Elaine tapped her chin thoughtfully. A clerk, you say? Most clerks are better spoken than you, Master Hark, but I'll offer you a chance to give evidence for your claim. Would you send for a lap desk, Master Norrie? Norrie gave a thin smile. How could the man make a smile seem dry? No need, my lady. The magistrate in the case had the same idea. For the first time that she'd ever seen, he took a sheet of paper from the folder clutched to his chest. She thought trumpets should sound. Hark's smile faded away completely as his eyes followed that page from Norrie's hand to hers. One glance was all that was needed. A few uneven lines covered less than half the sheet, the letters cramped and awkward. No more than half a dozen words were actually legible, and those barely. Hardly the hand of a clerk, she murmured. Returning the page to Norrie, she tried to make her face stern. She had seen her mother passing judgment. Morgase had been able to make herself appear implacable. I fear, Master Hark, that you will sit in a cell until the magistrates in Four Kings can be queried, and soon after that you will hang. Hark's lips writhed, and he put a hand to his throat as if he could already feel the noose. Unless, of course, you agree to follow a man for me. A dangerous man who doesn't like to be followed. If you can tell me where he goes at night, instead of hanging, you'll be exiled to Bearlawn, where you would be well advised to find a new line of work. The governor will be informed of you. Suddenly Hark's smile was back. Of course, my lady. I'm innocent, but I can see how things look dark against me. I can. I'll follow any man you want me to. I was your mother's man, I was, and I'm your man too. Loyal is what I am, my lady. Loyal if I suffers for it. Birgitta snorted derisively. Arrange for Master Hark to see Millar's face without being seen, Birgitta. The man was unmemorable, but there was no point in taking chances. And turn him loose. Hark looked ready to dance, iron chains or no iron chains. But first, You see this, Master Hark? She held up her right hand so he could not miss the great serpent ring. You may have heard that I am Aes Sedai. With the power already in her, it was a simple matter to weave spirit. It is true. The weave she laid on Hark's belt buckle, his boots, his coat and breeches, was somewhat akin to that for the warder bond, though much less complex. It would fade from the clothing and boots in a few weeks, or months at best, but metal would hold a finder forever. I've laid a weave on you, Master Hark. Now you can be found wherever you are. In truth, only she would be able to find him. A finder was attuned to the one who wove it, but there was no reason to tell him that. Just to be sure that you are indeed loyal. Hark's smile seemed frozen in place. Sweat beaded on his forehead. When Birgitta went to the door and called in Hansard, giving him instructions to take Hark away and keep him safe from prying eyes, Hark staggered and would have fallen if the husky guardsman had not held him up on the way out of the room. I fear I may just have given Melar a sixth victim, Elaine muttered. He hardly seems capable of following his own shadow without tripping over his boots. It was not so much Hark's death she regretted. The man would have hanged for sure. I want whoever put that bloody man in my palace. I want them so badly my teeth ache. The palace was riddled with spies. Rena had uncovered above a dozen beyond Skelet, though she believed that was all of them. But whether Melar had been set to spy or to facilitate kidnapping her, he was worse than the others. He had arranged for men to die, or he had killed them in order to gain his place. That those men had thought they were to kill her made no difference. Murder was murder. Trust me, my lady, Nori said, laying a finger alongside his long nose. Cut purses are stealthy by nature, yet they seldom last long. Sooner or later they cut the purse of someone faster afoot than someone who doesn't wait for the guards. He made a quick gesture as if stabbing someone. Chapter 17.
Alright, everyone, I'm gonna call into the stream for tonight. But excuse me. I want to thank everyone for stopping by and everyone who keeps stopping by. Definitely appreciate all y'all's support. Till next time, everyone. Y'all stay safe.